Today we have Rick Weintraub with us. He's my mentor and a mentor to many throughout the years. He's a Messianic Jew and has been teaching Bible class for 60 years now?
Not quite, but pretty close.
We're getting there. So he's going to walk us through Leviticus for a few weeks here, and let's have at it, Rick.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's always good to be with you, even though we're on Zoom here. We've known each other for, well, how old is Drew now?
Oh gosh, he's 23.
So we've known each other for about 25 or 28 years or something like that. And
that's hard to believe.
Yeah, it is hard to believe. The years go by pretty quickly. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here with you and with your group. And even though I can't see them right now, I'm hopeful, based upon what you have told me, that we'll be able to give them some insight into a book of the Bible that I don't get a lot of people asking me to teach. I've studied it a lot, and I think I know enough about it to be able to be dangerous here. However, we'll get to that in just a little bit. I thought it might be helpful for the folks to know a little bit about me, to help them to understand that while I'm not a biblical expert, I have had some background in it because being fortunate enough to have been born into a very religious Jewish background, and having studied it as a kid, and then when I became a believer, to really understood its place and why it's important that Christians understand some of the things that are written in Leviticus, because it really does pertain to all of us today, even though it has some things in it that are cultural, if you will, for the time frame in which Moses wrote it. But nevertheless, there's some really interesting things in Leviticus, and God very clearly explains why he wants us to be knowledgeable about it. Now, as for me, let me begin at the beginning. That's always a good place to start, is at the beginning. So the first immigrant to my family was my great-grandfather, whose English name was Solomon. His Hebrew name was Shlomo, but he came to America in about 1880 with his wife and his 5-year-old son, who was my grandfather. He came from what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I, because of extreme religious persecution against the Jewish people, which was common in Central and Eastern Europe during those years, and actually culminated in the 1940s at the Holocaust. But he came to America, and he was a rabbi. The reason I know that is that in 1935, he married my parents. And I have a photograph of him at the wedding. And I also happen to know, since I'm named after him, that his father and his grandfather, at least, were also rabbis. His name was, as I said, Shlomo, or Solomon. His father's name was Mordecai, and his grandfather's name was Aaron. And they were all rabbis in some town in the Hungarian Austrian area. There was some debate over whether he was Austrian or Hungarian, but whatever, he did come to America in about 1880. My grandfather grew up in New Jersey, where he married a woman who was also from the same country, and they had 3 children. They had 2 daughters to start with, and their third child was born in February of 1912. And that was my dad. And he was born in New Jersey, grew up in Manhattan, and he was interested in medicine. And so in those days, unlike today, where you go to college and then you go to medical school and then you do an internship, in those days, you went straight from high school into medical school. And so he graduated from medical school at the age of 23 in 1935. And he married my mother that same year. My mother's parents were from Ukraine, on the northwest side of what we now know as Kiev. Everybody knows where Ukraine is and where Kiev is now. They didn't up until now, but they do now. There were hundreds of teeny little Jewish villages all over that area between Kiev and the almost to the Romanian border. And Ukraine was part of Russia in those days. Ukraine became part of Russia about 200 years before that in the 1700s under an empress whose name was Catherine the Great, but that's a whole different study. My grandmother was about 15 or 16 years old. She was the oldest child of her mother. And my grandmother was tasked, as a lot of young people were in those days, with going to America. The older people knew that there was no life for them as Jews in that part of the world. And so they would take their youngest child, or at least the child that had the most energy and drive to make the long trip. And my grandmother told me this story about how her mother sewed money into the hem of her dress and sent her off to America. And the way they did it then was kind of like the way we had the Underground Railroad in the United States for the African Americans who were enslaved and trying to get to freedom. The children would travel on a road between the Ukraine and the nearest port, which was Amsterdam in the Netherlands, about 1,500 miles. And my grandmother, whose name was Ida, made the trip in about 3 months. And she told me that she had to travel almost exclusively at night for safety, and that she would sometimes get a ride on a cart, but mostly she walked. And when she got to Amsterdam, she went to the docks and she purchased a ticket on a freighter to go to New York. But there was no freighter leaving for 3 days. And she said to me just like this: Amsterdam was a very wicked city. And I think it may still be, Scott.
I think so. It has that reputation.
It does. Anyway, she boarded with these two other girls. They got on the boat together and they sailed to New York, and she landed in New York Harbor. She was 15 or 16 years old. She gets off the boat. In those days, a lot of people were coming to America from Europe, and they would land on the docks. They didn't speak any English, so people would come to them, and they would determine what language they could understand. And so they'd hook up with people from either the same country that they came from or people that spoke the same language that they did. And so my grandmother was taken in by a family. She got a job as a sewing machine girl in what used to be the garment district in Manhattan. The garment district is now in Pakistan, but that's again another story. So she was a young woman, and she was a religious young woman, so she went to synagogue, and that's where she met my grandfather. Now, his story is also kind of interesting. He also came from Ukraine, from those little villages. In 1905, the Russians and the Japanese went to war in the Far East. It was a short war. The Russians got clobbered by the Japanese. And the Tsar, in order to get enough people to serve in his military, would send the Cossacks into these little villages in the southern part of his country, and they'd scarf up all the young men, and they would impress them into the military. So my grandfather was impressed into the Russian Navy, which was headquartered in Vladivostok, which is on the far eastern side of the country. And so he was shipped off to Vladivostok, and by the time he got there, the war was over, because the Japanese had essentially destroyed the Russian Navy and easily won the war, and the Russians had to sue for peace. So here he is in Vladivostok, and he is in the Russian Navy. And in those days, you just didn't say, well, I quit, or they didn't discharge you. You were there possibly forever. And the only way to get out of the military was to be injured. And so he punctured the eardrum on his right ear, and that allowed him to get a medical discharge. Somehow he made his way across the Eurasian continent from Vladivostok in far eastern Russia to Liverpool in England, which was another place you could catch a ship that was going to New York. He was about 25 at the time. He lands in New York. He goes to the same synagogue. He meets this young woman who's 6 years younger than he is. And they get married on June the 1st, 1912. They're very religious Jews. They are very kosher. They obey as many of the rules of the way they understand it. They spoke only two languages. They spoke Russian and they spoke Yiddish, which is kind of a German Hebrew dialect. But they began to make their way. My grandfather had been trained as a young kid as a carpenter. And so he knew how to make furniture. And so he got a job in New York, in Manhattan, with a man who had a furniture shop, and he would make furniture. To this day, we have a desk that he made for himself, and it's an heirloom in our family. Well, my mother was born on June the 1st, 1914, on their second wedding anniversary. And she was the one who, once she was old enough to go to kindergarten, she was the one who taught her parents to speak English. And they spoke English very well, although with a very thick accent, as I remember as a kid. Fast forward a few years, my mom graduates from high school. She gets a job. She goes to the beach in Coney Island, and she meets a young man who has just graduated from, or is about to graduate from medical school. On June the 30th, 1935, after he graduates from college and has his medical degree, they get married and they move to Brooklyn, New York, where he opens his practice. Mom was a stay-at-home mother for a couple of years. That was the thing to do in those days. And Dad began his practice. In 1938, Scott, I'm going to age myself now. 1938, I was born. I was their firstborn son, and I was the firstborn grandson to both of their parents. Now, in Jewish life, that's a big deal. The firstborn son, the firstborn grandson on both sides, especially since my great-grandfather was a rabbi. So I was destined to be trained in an Orthodox synagogue. And so as I grew, by the time I was 9 years old, it was time for me to get my religious training. So I was excused from public school and was sent to a very religious Jewish school for 4 years, until I was 13. And in that school, I studied Hebrew and I'd studied Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Bible. And I studied them in English and in Hebrew. Unfortunately, I've lost a lot of that Hebrew because I never kept up with it, but it opened my eyes to the study of the word, if you will. The interesting thing about it is, and this will come in just a little bit, is the way the rabbis taught us was something that has stayed with me all of my life. The rabbis taught us by putting two kids like you and I, Scott, across the table from each other. And they'd say, they open the Bible and they'd say, study this portion in, let's say, Leviticus. And then they'd give you a commentary that a rabbi wrote about what he thinks the interpretation of that is. And he'd give me an interpretation of another rabbi. And you and I would have to have a discussion, a debate as to which rabbi was correct and what we believed. And we would have to go out and the rabbi would be listening to see if we were getting past the words and into the real meaning. And then just about the time that he felt we had reached the end of our rope, he would snap his fingers and you'd have to take the argument of my rabbi and I'd have to take the argument of your rabbi and we'd have to go back at it together. And this was a way of helping us to not take everything at face value, but to really peel it back. And it taught me at the time how to persuade, if you will, and how to organize my mind to help me to get you to understand what I was trying to do. That'll come in real handy lately in two ways. One is scripturally, and the other one was my career. So as I grew up and finally graduated from college, I had two things in hand. there's only two things I wanted to do when I was a kid. One was I wanted to play baseball. And two, I wanted to fly airplanes. Well, I couldn't hit a curveball, so I went to Plan B, and I got a commission in the United States Air Force. And I went to flight training, and my first duty station after mustering in San Antonio was Waco, Texas. Now, God had a plan for that too. I didn't realize it at the time because I really wanted to go to pilot training, but I had an astigmatism in my left eye, and they didn't allow us to go to pilot training with that going on. And so I was assigned to navigator training in Waco. When I was in Waco, two things happened. Again, the Lord was in both of these, because if I had gone to pilot training, I wouldn't have gone to Waco. I might have gone to Florida, or I might have gone to Arizona, or I might have gone to California, because there were pilot training bases all over the place. But no, I went to Waco, Texas. Two things happened. Number one, and most importantly, is people began to witness to me and try to convert me, because they had not met very many Jewish people. And so I began to use that technique that I learned as a child in Hebrew school by asking questions and trying to understand not just what they believe, but why they believed it. And what I discovered is that many Christians know what they believe. They don't know why they believe it.
Yeah.
Jesus said it, and I believe it, and that's it. Well, why did he say it? I don't know. He said it. Okay, fine. So there were no answers. So I wound up going to being curious and really wanting to know why are all these people so sincere and they believe this stuff? It just didn't make any sense to me. So I went to a place in Waco, a church called Seventh and James Baptist Church, which is near the Baylor campus. And I met a pastor whose name was Charles Wilburn. And Charles was wonderful. He was open. He talked to me. He didn't try to badger me, but he gave me something which was, I think I have it here. He gave me this little book. I don't know if y'all can see it.
Oh, yeah.
It says New Testament, Old Testament Prophecy Edition. And so when you open it up to page 1, there's a guy named Matthew who wrote in here. Well, I didn't know Matthew from anything. Didn't sound like a Jewish name to me. But if you begin to read Matthew in here, in the bottom of the page, every time something happens where a prophecy from the Old Testament or a word from the Old Testament comes into play, it annotates it. So I was able to sit with this in one hand and my Hebrew Bible in the other hand and say, hey, I didn't know that was the case. I didn't know anything about the New Testament. I was a blank slate. And so this little testament really helped out a great deal. The second thing that happened while I was in Waco, which again God orchestrated, was the first Sunday I was there, a group of guys with me said, hey, let's go over to the Baylor campus and check out the women. And so we were all 21, I think, at the time, some young age, and we went over there. It was a beautiful day. It was the Sunday before Thanksgiving. And as you know, in November, it can be 75 degrees or 80 degrees here and just absolutely gorgeous. And it was that day. And a young woman was sitting out with her friend on a bench. And one of the guys went over and struck up a conversation. And I went over and I met them. And it was kind of a cool, hey, nice to meet you, that kind of thing. Well, the following week, he came to my bedroom and he said, hey, Rick, let's call those girls and take them out dancing and feed them dinner at the officers club. I said, okay, great. So he called and he got a young woman named Pat Sullivan on the line, and he asked her to go. And she said, well, Bob, we have a problem. And he said, what's that? She said, well, I was sitting down when you saw me, but I'm about 4 inches taller than you are. So if you'll fix me up with your friend, I'll fix you up with my friend. So Pat asked for the first date. Did you know that, Scott?
So it was the height difference that did it.
It is, it was.
Oh, that's crazy.
I was 6'1" and she's 5'9", and Bob was about 5'7", and so anyway, she didn't want to dance with a guy who came, only up to here.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's how we met. And today we've been preparing to celebrate our 60th wedding anniversary. And so the two things God did sending me to Waco was to meet Jesus and to meet her. When I began to study the book of Matthew, to understand why is it that people believe in Jesus the way they do, and what is it about the prophecies that cause them to have this sincere belief? And I began to compare the prophecies with what were the things that Matthew, whose real name was Levi, as you know. By the way, Matthew is a anglicized version of the name Mattathias, which was probably his original name. That's another whole biblical thing that is hard to get through, is that all the names in the Bible that we now know today did not exist back then.
Well, like you've told me that J's didn't exist, right?
Yeah, there's no J in Hebrew,
Yeah.
there's no J in Greek, there's no J in Latin. The only language that has a J is English, which is derived from German, which has J's. And even in German, J is pronounced like a Y. But English has J. Are we getting off subject here?
A little bit, but it's a fascinating.
English has J's. And so when King James, James the First of England, who succeeded Queen Elizabeth I, when he asked a group of 53 individuals to put the Bible into what we now know as the King James Version, in order to honor him, they changed all of the Y's to J's. The book of Yaakov, which is Jacob in English, became the book of James. That's how all that happened. But that's that's a whole different thing. People ask me, why is the New Testament written in Greek when none of those people spoke Greek? Maybe Luke did, but none of those guys spoke. They spoke Aramaic, they spoke Hebrew, but they didn't speak Greek. Well, that's a whole different story also, because that goes back to 300 years or so before Jesus. But we can talk about that also. Where was I? Okay, so I got my wings in Waco. I was a navigator, but I wanted to. I could have taken any assignment that was open, and I took an assignment to what was then a brand new airplane. It's called a B-52. It was just coming online, and I thought it'd be cool to be in a brand new airplane. So I had to go to bombardment training and radar training, and I went to California to outside of Sacramento. It was there by myself, sitting in my room, that the Lord came and just absolutely put his hand on me. And I knew that I had to make a decision because the Spirit of the Lord was so strong on me. I did not understand it at the time. I'm talking in words that I know now, but then it was a feeling of what is happening here. So I got up one morning on Sunday morning and I said, I've got to go to church. I got to talk to somebody. Well, I didn't know one church from another church. So for those of you who may be old enough, you remember telephone books? Well, I got out the yellow pages and I looked up under church, and I was looking for something that was close to the base where I was stationed outside of Sacramento in a little town called Carmichael. And I found a church called El Camino Baptist Church, and it was right outside the main gate. So I went there on Sunday morning. And after the service was over, I went up front and I met the pastor, whose name was Damon Matlock, and he was from Clovis, New Mexico, which I didn't know where that was at the time. Now I do. But Mr. and Mrs. Matlock were wonderful. They invited me to lunch that day. I told him about the path that I had been on at that point in time for close to 2 years. Reading and trying to understand, how could this be? It doesn't make any sense, and he was very open. He easily gave me all the time, and we had long discussions. And so that in his church on Sunday night, January 15th, 1961. I walked up to the front, I gave my life to Christ, and I was baptized. So what's that, 61 years ago. When you start out as a brand new believer, you don't know squat you don't even know what you don't know. And so I began reading. Well, Matthew was great. In fact, the verse of scripture that sent me over the limit was in Matthew, where Jesus said, if you love your father and mother more than me, then you're not worthy of me. Now, I knew my parents were not exactly as religious as their parents were, but yet they maintained the semblance of a Jewish faith. And I knew that this was going to be a very difficult thing for them. And the devil was using that to hold me back. But once I read that scripture, that if I wanted to be worthy of him, then I had to love him more than anything. That's when I became a believer. Well, as a result of that, two things happened. When my wife graduated from Baylor, she came out to California. She got a job teaching. We spent 6 months dating because she had been back in Waco and I was in California for I don't know, probably 8 or 9 months before that. And so we kind of needed to get together again. Well, we finally decided, she decided I was good enough to marry. So she said yes. Her dad was a Baptist preacher. Pat was a missionary kid. She grew up in Brazil as a missionary kid. Her dad sent her to Baylor to marry a preacher. And she brings home this Jewish kid from Brooklyn. But she and he had a relationship that when she said, I want to get married to Rick, he came out and he married us. And that was great. And he and I always had a great relationship. So we got married in 1962. So here in about a month and a half, we'll celebrate our 60th wedding anniversary. And God has been gracious because we have 2 children. They have given us 6 grandchildren. And those 6 grandchildren have thus far given us 4 great-grandchildren, the latest of which was born just 2 weeks ago. We have 2 boys and 2 girls, great-grandchildren, which are wonderful. All the family lives here in Texas, Arlington and Mansfield, except one grandson who is just got his law degree from Penn State, and he's clerking for a judge up there while he looks around for a position here in Texas. And so we are extremely blessed in so many ways. The family, obviously, Scott, you have watched my family grow as I've watched your family grow. And you have been part of the blessings that God put on me as being able to teach scripture. The way I got into teaching scripture was interesting. People assumed because I was Jewish that I knew the Old Testament inside and out. That was not true. I had studied mostly Torah and a little bit of prophecy, but nothing else. And it wasn't a very deep understanding. So they would ask me to teach. Well, if you're going to teach, you better be prepared. So I began studying in order to be able to teach. And through the years, I think I first taught when I was about 25. So what's that? I'm 84, almost 84. So what's that? Almost 60 years. Hey, you were right. Almost 60.
I was close. I was pretty close.
And so I began teaching young people my age. And then Pat and I began to teach a young married class at our church, a Fielder Church in Arlington. And that class grew and grew and grew. You remember how many times we split, Scott?
Oh, yeah.
Pat and I counted up, we split 15 times and created new classes. Got to the point of age where I thought it was best to pass off the generational thing to a couple that's a little younger than us that would be able to talk to these young people. And so now I teach a class of people who are in their 50s and 60s, some of which, interestingly enough, were young marrieds in my class 40 years ago when we first started, and who are now grandparents. And their children and grandchildren are in young married classes in our church.
That's crazy.
Which my son-in-law and daughter teach. So God has blessed us enormously in so many ways. There's just no way to tell you. And I've come to a much deeper understanding as life goes on, because when you're young and you experience something, it's hard to understand what God's doing. You can only understand what he's doing in retrospect. When you look back and say, oh, that's why I didn't get my pilot training. That's why when the company tried to get me to move to New York, I said no. That because my kids met somebody here and they married somebody. There's all kinds of things, but you can't understand it at the time. And so in our lives, in Pat and I's life, we've experienced 60 years of being believers, and 60 years of marriage, and 60 years of parenting and grandparenting, and now great grandparenting. And I will tell you, for those of you who are listening, there's no new stuff under the sun. Just like Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, everything's the same, just repeats itself. And so it's always good. Scott earlier used the word mentor. It's always good to have a mentor who's about 20 years older than you are, who's been through the things that you're trying to go through right now. When I turned 80, I asked the Lord for a vision for the rest of my life. I said, what do you want me to do? I learned that from a guy who made a comment to me one time. He said, Rick, when you get up in the morning, he said, when you open your eyes, say, good morning, Lord, what have you got for me to do today? So I sat down by myself and I said, Lord, what have you got for me to do for the rest of my life? And he mentioned these things. He says, first of all, I want you to keep teaching the Bible. I want you to keep teaching because I'm giving you the knowledge to be able to speak into people's lives. Somebody once asked me, what's your gift? I said, well, I guess it's the gift of teaching you. He goes, no. You have the gift of prophecy because people listen and they hear the Lord. They don't hear you. And that's prophetic. The second thing I want you to do, he says, I want you to be the patriarch of your family. He says, your son and your son-in-law and your daughter and daughter, they're old enough to be able to handle it, but they're going to come to you every now and say, Dad, what do you think? Well, now I have a 30-year-old grandson who comes to me and says, Grandpa, what do you think? And so be the patriarch of your family as you get older. The third thing, he says, I want you to mentor younger men. And people, will call on the phone and they'll say, hey, can I come visit with you? And they may have a job issue or a child issue, or they just need to get a second opinion, so to speak. And so that happens a lot. And he says, the fourth thing I want you to do is what I call the catch-all. He says, there'll be stuff come along I'm not going to tell you about right now, but you just be open to what it is. And so that's what I'm doing at this stage in my life. As I said, I'll be 84 years old in October, and God has given me pretty good health, except for arthritis, which you don't want to hear about. Somebody once said to me, how you doing? I said, well, you get to be this age, life is a pain in the fill in the blank.
It could be any part.
Yeah. Your neck, your shoulder, your back, your knees, whatever. Just deal with it because nothing you can do about it. There's no cure for arthritis. I don't care how many Tylenols you take. It doesn't work. And so you just keep going and let the Lord take care of the issues that you're dealing with. And so that's kind of the way we've been doing it. One other thing I will say, Scott, until we get into I don't know how much time we have left here on this one, but one of the things that God led us to do when we were in Albuquerque, New Mexico for a season, when I was working, and that is we've been doing Passover Seders in churches now since 1981 or 2. It's about 40 years. We did one the other day at my daughter's house for her young married class. I had 24 people there, young people. And people begin to understand what Jesus did, how he fulfilled Leviticus, how he fulfilled Isaiah, how he fulfilled the other prophets. Why did he quote from Psalms? Why did he tell us certain things that we had to know? What is, we call them the Beatitudes. That's a Latin word. The sermon that he preached on that mount in northern Israel. Well, I stood on the place where he stood when he taught that, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. And to see how many people, it said 5,000 people were sitting there listening to him. And the words that he used in that sermon, everything that you can read in the New Testament that he said, you can find in the Old Testament, either directly or as a fulfillment to a word that God gave the individual who wrote those words. And so for me, the Bible is not Old Testament and New Testament. The Bible is one book that is centered on God, on his holiness, on his plan for salvation that he accomplished through Jesus. And so that's kind of where I come down on teaching the scripture, because I think people need to understand, as I said earlier, not just what you believe, but why you believe it. And once you get that into your heart and soul, you want to know more about God. You want to know, what's his personality like? What's his character like? Why does he give us these things to say? When somebody says to you, why did God order all those people killed in the Old Testament? Well, there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. He has an unamount, a huge amount, so to speak, of love in his heart for everybody. And he wants us to come to him. And so understanding these things from the Old Testament really helps you in deepening your own faith and giving you an opportunity to explain it to other people. So, Scott, how much time do we have and where do we go from here?
Just the main thing I wanted to get as we start Leviticus is, like when we were talking, you mentioned that it's the heart of the law. So how is Leviticus the heart of the law? That'll be a good place to start.
I think that's a good question. The easy way for me to explain it is there are 5 books of the law. There's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. By the way, those 5 titles are not Hebrew. They are Greek. They're from the Greek translation called the Septuagint. The Hebrew names are very different. But the middle book is Leviticus. And everything before Leviticus and everything after Leviticus, the Genesis and Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, all flow into and from Leviticus. And I think Christians misunderstand Leviticus a lot because we tend to ignore it because it has things in it that we don't do anymore. It has complicated reasoning. And there are parts when it's hard to understand. I get that. It talks about things that are cultural things that we don't do anymore. Example is, I wrote down a couple of examples of cultural things that are in play these days. Whether or not you believe these or not is not important. What it is, it talks about capital punishment. It talks about how you should cut your hair. It talks about homosexuality. It talks about tattoos. It talks about eating pork and shrimp. It talks about owning slaves. There are things in Leviticus that are cultural things which don't go with 21st century thinking because it's 12th century BC thinking. And so Christians tend to say, well, let's just see what Jesus has to say. Cultural laws may change, but moral laws do not change. Moral laws are the same yesterday, today, and forever. The essence of the book of Leviticus is summed up in Leviticus 11:14, where God says, "Be holy, for I am holy." And that was such an important verse that you'll find an exact the exact words in 1 Peter chapter 1, be holy, for I am holy. So that's one reason. God wants his people to be holy, to be unique, to be set aside, not to be like everybody else. The second thing that I think that's important is that Leviticus gives us a foretaste of the importance of sacrifice. Now, in Leviticus, you'll read a lot about animal sacrifice. Well, we don't do that anymore. But it is a forerunner of the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And that brings us to today, where God requires you and I to be sacrificial in serving, in giving, in loving, those kinds of things. So look at it this way. Genesis is God creating the world and his people, and then calling his people to him. He issues the call to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Exodus is preparing his people through trial to rely on him and providing for the salvation of those people through bringing them out of Egypt. And it required what? Great sacrifice. And he says, I am holy. I represent life and purity and justice and goodness, and you are sinful. You're disobedient. You're unjust. And so Leviticus begins with the words, and the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of the meeting. At the end of Exodus, the temple or the tabernacle had been built, but Moses couldn't enter. He wasn't holy. God was holy. And he filled the tent with a cloud, and his presence was there. But the people couldn't go in. So God reaches out and calls Moses, and by the way, the Hebrew word for the book is vaikre, which means and he called. That's the Hebrew word of the book. So he calls to Moses from the tent of the meeting, and he begins saying, speak to the Israelites, and then the book begins to go into the parameters that God wants his people to follow in order to be unique, to be holy, to be set aside, to be acceptable to him. And that is what the book of Leviticus is about. There are temporal laws that are cultural for the time. Let me give you a good one that's really hot nowadays. Don't anybody get excited. The book of Leviticus says, don't let your skin be tattooed. Well, why is that? Because in those days, that was a sign of paganism. Okay? It was a sign of paganism. It was a cultural thing. God said, hey, all these people that are pagans that don't follow me, they decorate up their bodies. So don't do that. Okay? It's not a moral law. It was a cultural law. He said, don't eat shrimp because it's not kosher. Well, it's because shrimp could make you die in those days. That's not true anymore. It's a cultural law. But then he goes into the moral laws, which have to do with morality and how we conduct ourselves. And to help you understand that, when Paul wrote, your body is the temple of the Lord, that comes from Leviticus. That's what Paul was telling us about. So over the next few weeks, as we go through that, Scott, I'll try to help our people understand what's cultural, what's moral, what is important, what do we pay attention to. And then there's another section in Leviticus, which I think people will like, and that is the plan of salvation. That's a Baptist term. The plan of salvation is very clearly laid out in the book of Leviticus. Now, Leviticus came hundreds, maybe thousands of years before Jesus. But as John said, he is the Word. Jesus is the Word. And so God was helping prepare his people for the ultimate sacrifice. And that's in the book of Leviticus also. Numbers is nothing more than, okay, now that you got all this stuff that you're supposed to live by, let's get organized. Okay. And, Numbers is full of numbers. This tribe has that many people. It's an organizational book. Okay. Deuteronomy, which is a Greek word that means second law, is merely a reiteration of Leviticus. And so that'll help you understand why Leviticus is the central part of the law. So I hope that helps as a beginning, and we'll get after it whenever we're ready to go.
Okay, that's great, Rick. I can listen to you all day.
Oh, you're very kind.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate you and can't wait to dig into it for the next few weeks.
Okay, sounds great. I'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay, thank you, Rick.
Okay, bye-bye.